Welcome to this explainer. Look, if you track global politics, you already know the Middle East landscape has radically shifted since October 2023. We're cutting through the daily headlines right now to look at the hard data. We're going to unpack the actual financial costs and the intense strategic debates surrounding America's latest military actions in the region. So here is the big question everyone is arguing about. Is the U.S. actually benefiting from these recent Middle East conflicts, or is it just being dragged by allies, like Israel, into endless, unwinnable wars? To figure that out, we're going to dig into the actual financial receipts and look at some contrasting theories from top geopolitical scholars to see what's really happening beneath the surface.
Section 1. The post-2023 financial toll.
Let's just start with the raw numbers, because they are massive. According to the Costs of War project at Brown University, the U.S. has shelled out upwards of $33 billion on Middle East military activities. And get this, that's just a 2-year window, factoring in projected costs through September 2025. That is a staggering amount of taxpayer money deployed extremely quickly.
Now, how does that money break down? Well, a massive chunk, over $21.7 billion, went straight to U.S. military aid for Israel. But the rest of it is really interesting. Nearly $10 billion, maybe even up to $12 billion, actually funded wider American military operations across the region. So we're not just talking about writing checks for foreign aid. We're talking about direct, extensive U.S. military action on multiple active fronts.
Just look at the scale of those wider regional operations. The Brown University data points to Operation Rough Rider, which was this huge bombing campaign against Houthi targets in Yemen to keep the Red Sea open. Then there's Operation Midnight Hammer, targeting Iran's nuclear facilities. And this exposes a massive strategic headache for the Pentagon: cost asymmetry. I mean, the U.S. has literally been firing multi-million-dollar THAAD interceptors to shoot down incredibly cheap Houthi drones. They actually burned through almost a quarter of the military's entire THAAD stockpile doing this. The material and financial drain is just wild.
Section 2. Asset or strategic burden.
To really grasp the traditional view in Washington, you just need to hear this classic quote from President Joe Biden: "If there were not an Israel, we'd have to invent one." That perfectly sums up the establishment consensus. For decades, the mainstream political view has been that Israel is this absolutely irreplaceable strategic asset, a totally reliable democratic outpost in a really chaotic part of the world.
But is that still true today? Academia is fiercely debating this. Look, historically, it made total sense. Back in the Cold War, Israel was a crucial shield for containing Soviet expansion, especially after 1967. But there's this growing modern critique. Prominent political scientists like John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt argue that things have changed. They claim the relationship has actually morphed into a strategic burden. Basically, they argue that unconditional U.S. support just fuels regional anti-American anger, messes up diplomacy everywhere else, and constantly isolates the U.S. at the United Nations.
Section 3. The defense industry factor.
But hey, we can't ignore the economics right here at home. A really fascinating study in the journal PLOS mapped out exactly how news of overseas conflict hits the domestic stock market. It's a direct chain of causality. The second news breaks about armed conflict in the Middle East, investor sentiment flips. People instantly anticipate a flood of future defense contracts to restock all those depleted weapons, and that expectation goes straight into stock prices.
And the result? It is super clear. Researchers found that when the Hamas-Israel conflict broke out, it triggered a roughly 10% jump in the equity returns for U.S. defense industry exchange-traded funds. So while regular markets tend to freak out over geopolitical chaos, the defense sector absolutely thrives on it. Considering the Middle East buys about 40% of all U.S. arms exports, regional instability directly feeds into a highly profitable military-industrial complex.
Section 4. Who drives the policy?
All this brings us to a classic foreign policy question. Does the tail wag the dog? Meaning, are regional allies effectively dragging the massive U.S. superpower into endless conflicts that actually hurt American interests? Or is Washington pulling the strings, willingly using these allies to project its own global power?
Academics are split into two completely different camps on this. On one side, you have the Israel lobby theory from Mearsheimer and Walt. They basically argue that a super-organized domestic lobby forces the U.S. to blindly back its ally, even when it causes massive financial drain and diplomatic headaches. But then, on the flip side, you have the hegemon and client state theory from scholars like Pierre Gerlain. He says the whole tail wagging the dog concept is a total myth. In his view, the U.S. is a willing, totally Machiavellian superpower that is perfectly happy to use regional proxies to lock down military footholds and, as we just discussed, feed its own defense industry. According to this camp, the U.S. knows exactly what it's doing.
Section 5. Assessing the strategic ledger.
So what's the actual reality check here? It's a fascinating tension. Based on data from the U.S. Army War College Press, the U.S. is actually trying to step back. Troop numbers in the Middle East have plummeted from a high of 250,000 down to just over 40,000. The Pentagon desperately wants to pivot its attention and resources toward great power competition with China. But here's the catch. Despite wanting to leave, these ongoing wars constantly threaten to pull the U.S. right back into massive regional escalations, all while draining billions of dollars and leaving America diplomatically isolated.
I'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. We've gone over the billions spent, the depleted missile stockpiles, the booming defense stocks, and the intense debate over who is actually in charge of the policy. So, looking at the hard data on this geopolitical ledger, do these ongoing Middle Eastern interventions actually secure America's future, or do they compromise it? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the data.